Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Geriatric's Grand Rounds. But before we get started, just a few announcements. Our next Grand Rounds is November 30th. Our speaker is Lauren Nicholas, and the topic is dementia and finances. Our next journal club is not until March 14th, 2024, just confirmed. The presenters will be Sarah Teets and Hillary Lum at that time. Other announcements: following today's Grand Rounds, you will receive an email with a link to the recording of today's presentation. Also included in the email will be a link to an online evaluation. Please submit questions in the chat or Q&A boxes anytime during the presentation today to be facilitated afterwards. I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Lyndsey DuBose. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Medicine, Division of Geriatric Medicine at the University of Colorado, Anschutz here. She holds degrees in exercise science and human physiology. Her current work uses translational approaches to investigate mechanisms underlying sex-specific risk factors like adverse outcomes of pregnancy, infertility, and menopause for premature or accelerated in vascular and cognitive aging in women. A big round of applause for Dr. DuBose.
All right, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I've been in the division for almost 4 years now, and this is my second time to present, but my first time in person. So thanks for being here. This is exciting for me. So an outline of today, I will talk briefly first about vascular contributions to brain aging. This will be in the context of just aging itself. I'll discuss the role of sex differences and sex hormones in modifying this relation, and then I'll talk a little bit about modifiable factors for slowing brain aging at the very end. So my work and my background is really in the large central arteries, which encompass the aorta and the common carotids. These arteries are elastic, just like the name implies, but their goal is really to buffer high pressure that's generated when the heart contracts. Second, they also conduct a continuous flow out to the periphery. And this is important because for organs like the brain, which are high flow and low resistance, they help to protect our brain over time. It's important to note that as we get older, unfortunately, even if we do everything right, we start to lose some of that elastic tissue and we actually replace it with collagen. And so these tissues go from being elastic in nature to being more stiff like a PVC pipe. Large artery stiffness, which is bad and occurs with aging, has been shown for almost 2 decades now to be associated with cognitive outcomes as well as predictive of dementia. Notably, they've been associated with both cross-sectional and longitudinal changes in cognition. These are primarily regions of the brain, subcortical regions of the brain, like processing speed, executive function, and memory, which are all important for our day-to-day lives. But most importantly, they've also been associated with clinical outcomes, including the development of mild cognitive impairment, predictive of those who are going to transition to dementia, including Alzheimer's disease, as well as the biomarkers of these dementia processes themselves. What's important is that to date, there are no successful therapies for developing or preventing the development of dementia. But in 2016, as people were starting to rethink because of these failed therapies, what is the pathophysiology of these processes, there was a large multi-site study called the ADNI study, the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative, which took about 3,000 individuals, and they put them through various neuroimaging tests for biomarkers of Alzheimer's disease. Shown here on the x-axis, they were looking at the transition of these biomarkers to becoming dysfunctional from healthy cognition to early mild cognitive impairment to late mild cognitive impairment and late onset Alzheimer's disease. The goal of this study was really to understand which biomarker actually becomes dysfunctional first in that transition from healthy cognition to early mild cognitive impairment. This study was coming out while I was a PhD student, and it really revolutionized some of my work during my PhD, because what the study showed is that it was actually this vascular component that actually became dysfunctional first. The way this study studied vascular was that it measured cerebral blood flow using MRI, a non-invasive form of MRI called arterial spin labeling. But what's notable here is that that vascular component became dysfunctional before amyloid beta, glucose metabolism and functional connectivity became dysfunctional in the brain. And so this really shed light on perhaps there's an early vascular contribution to these diseases and may be important for targeting and therapeutics. At the time, we wanted to know, well, what degree does large elastic artery stiffness contribute to these changes in that vascular component within the brain? And so this was work that I got to participate in as a PhD student at the University of Iowa. And I did some of this work with Lori Ponto, who ran all of the PET imaging studies at the university. We measured cerebral blood flow using the gold standard, which was O15 water. Essentially, we make water radioactive and we infuse it into people. It has a very short half-life. But we combined all the scans that she had ever done in her in her career, which was about 205 people. In a subset of people, we also measured cerebral vascular reactivity or cerebral vascular reserve, which is the ability of the brain vessels to augment blood flow when stimulated. So this is important. It's a functional, component of neurovascular coupling and is meant to really approximate vascular health in the brain itself. The way that we measure this is by infusing a 1 gram dose of acetazolamide, which is carbonic anhydrase inhibitor. And basically it fakes the brain into thinking that it has high CO2, and that causes maximal vasodilation in the brain while the drug is in your system. So just know that high cerebral blood flow is good and high cerebral vascular reserve is good. The way that we measure aortic stiffness non-invasively is using pulse wave velocity. I like to joke with participants that I told my high school physics teacher that I would never use physics, and joke's on me because I use physics every day. But the way we do this is non-invasively. We use a pressure tonometer that's applied to the carotid and the femoral waveform. And using software, we can calculate how fast that pulse wave travels through the vasculature between those two sites over time. And so all you need to know if it's 7:30 in the morning and you're like, I haven't had enough coffee for this, is that high stiffness is bad. So what we found was that aortic stiffness was associated with lower cerebral vascular reserve, or the ability to augment blood flow when stimulated, but was not related to resting blood flow itself. So this means, remember that I said resting blood flow is just kind of what we have going on in our brain when we're sleeping, but the things that make us us, that those cognitive components respond or are dependent on the ability to augment blood flow. And so we found that aortic stiffness was associated with an impaired ability to do that. So the next question we asked was, well, we infuse acetazolamide, and for most people, they don't interact with this drug on a day-to-day basis. So is this really functionally important? So a part of this protocol, we had participants come into the PET imaging center. And remember, I said these are invasive studies. They involve the placement of an arterial line. And so prior to that art line being placed, we taught individuals that participated in these studies a 15-item word list. About an hour later, while we were measuring their blood flow, we asked them to remember as many words as they could from that 15-item word list. And so we looked at memory recall during this condition. And after that, we also infused acetazolamide. So shown here are correlations looking at the association between aortic stiffness and the response in the hippocampus to acetazolamide as well as memory recognition. So recall that a higher pulse wave velocity is bad. It means that you have a stiffer aorta. What we found was that individuals who had a higher aortic stiffness also tended to have a lower response in the hippocampus, which is a region important for memory during the acetazolamide challenge. They had lower cerebral vascular reserve in the hippocampus. Secondly, we also found that there was a marginal association that those people who also had higher aortic stiffness were less likely to recall as many words when we asked them to recall, but was not related to memory blood flow itself. Some data I got an opportunity to work with as a PhD that I've always wanted to come back to is looking at the role of cerebral acidosis. So we hypothesize that when your brain is not able to send as much blood flow as it wants in those memory conditions, that probably there's some sort of acidosis that's occurring because there's not enough blood flow. But it's also important in the context of disease that acidosis is a central hallmark of all of these different hypotheses of how dementia occurs. So we can use a non-invasive measure of cerebral acidosis called cerebral T1-Rho. Essentially, it measures time, and all you need to know is that for individuals who have a lower pH, which is indicative of a higher acidosis, also have a longer relaxation time. So higher values, lower pH, higher acidosis. Work that Lori did while I was there showed that cerebral acidosis measured with T1-Rho is a non-invasive marker not only of acidosis, but also is increased across the spectrum as individuals transition from healthy cognition into the dementia spectrum. But it's also correlated with the hallmark pathologies of dementia itself, including amyloid deposition, cerebral metabolic dysregulation, and cognitive performance itself. So again, we wanted to take this a step further and say, okay, but what degree is this related to aortic stiffness? So again, shown on the x-axis in the figure on the left, we see aortic stiffness. And this time we correlated the change in blood flow in response to that memory condition compared with the resting blood flow. So this is PET imaging. We don't have the ability to do functional connectivity or fMRI during PET imaging, but this is a surrogate of it done in the PET scanner. What we see is that individuals who have higher aortic stiffness also tended to have a reduction in blood flow when we asked them to recall those words in the scanner. And that change in blood flow in response to that memory condition, in that individuals who had that reduction also had higher resting acidosis. And so this lends idea that perhaps at rest, these people not only are having impairments in their ability to augment blood flow, but they also have higher acidosis. However, I do want to note that it's not clear whether this is baseline acidosis that's impairing that response to augment blood flow, or if the reduction in blood flow itself is contributing to the acidosis. So my first conclusion here, just to briefly outline vascular contributions to brain aging, is that declines in cerebral blood flow may be the first biomarker to become dysfunctional in the pathogenesis, and that elevated aortic stiffness may impair the ability of the cerebral vasculature to augment blood flow when stimulated. So the next, what I want to discuss is sex differences in sex hormones. This is really my interest. And this also represents the transition from the end of my PhD when I came here. I was really interested in coming to Anschutz in part to work with Carrie in her work, her foundational work exploring menopause, but also to learn more about sex hormones. And part of this was because of work during my PhD, but also because women are more likely to develop dementia that doesn't seem completely explained by differences in lifespan. And so wanting to understand if perhaps some of these other data that had been shown in the literature showing that women might have an increased vascular contribution may be important. Importantly, there are sex differences in age-related changes or age-related increases in large artery stiffness across the life. These are data from combining all the data that Carrie has ever collected, as well as my PhD mentor, Gary Pierce at the University of Iowa. So data I'm about to show are in about 550 individuals. One other measure that we can do of large artery stiffness is called carotid stiffness. It's synonymous with aortic stiffness, just a different large artery. And we measure this by using ultrasound, carotid ultrasound. But just like aortic stiffness, all you need to know is that carotid stiffness is also bad. What we see when we plot about 550 individuals across the lifespan and differences in carotid stiffness is that, as you can see, carotid stiffness increases with age, a higher BMI. But if we just look at sex alone, there doesn't seem to be a difference. But what you can probably see just from the visual plot and what is marginal when we look at it in statistics is that there seems to be a difference in that age-related increase from midlife on. Looking closer at this point in which they start to diverge, we see that women, which are shown in red, seem to increase quicker after the age of 50. And that in later decades in life, they actually have significantly higher carotid stiffness compared with age-matched men. This work is preliminary, and we are trying to collect some more variables to look more into this relation. But of course, midlife for women is that important time that everybody loves to discuss, which is menopause. Carrie's raising her hand. It's going off the rails here. So work that I really wanted to do is to understand, well, what degree does menopause modify that relation between aging and large artery stiffness in females? So this is a plot. These are population means of hormones shown in estrogen across the stages of menopause. And these are the years approaching the final menstrual period, which is shown by that red star, as well as afterwards. And what you can clearly see is that as women approach that final menstrual period, there's a dramatic decline in estrogen, whereas it's lower, reaches low levels in postmenopause. It's important to note that when we are studying menopause, however, that it's confounded by a number of factors that when we're wanting to understand or isolate what are the regulatory actions of hormones itself, that it's challenged to isolate those just through cross-sectional studies. And that's because just like everybody loves to talk about menopause, and my participants do as well, menopause coincides with a number of other changes, and that's changes in chronological age, because unfortunately menopause is not a one-time event, as my participants often remind me. There can be changes in weight and body fat, including where we're putting body fat, work by Wendy Court, changes in lipids, and of course everybody's favorite, hot flashes and sleep. And so the takeaway is that the menopause transition is a dynamic period of change, but that makes it inherently hard to study as well. So one way we can isolate the regulatory actions of sex hormones itself is to use a drug model. And these medications are used in clinical practice, so I promise we're not torturing anybody. But we use gonadotropin releasing hormone antagonists, which are primarily given through an injection. However, an oral form is now available. But what these medications do is that they block the binding of gonadotropin releasing hormone to the anterior pituitary to lower the production of gonadotropins, which are follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Because of the reduced production of gonadotropins, there's less stimulation of the gonads, which are ovaries in women, to produce estradiol and progesterone. We can also randomize women to receive an estrogen patch or placebo. And so this produces a high estrogen state versus a low estrogen state, which allows us to study how hormones are important for how our body works. Work that I had the opportunity to work with of Carrie's that she did prior to me being here, because I started during the pandemic, is from an earlier R01 that she had. And what she did is she recruited women across the stages of menopause. Everybody went through baseline vascular testing, and then they were randomized. Everybody got that gonadotropin releasing hormone antagonist, and they were randomized to receive a placebo patch or an estrogen patch. And this intervention was for 6 days. What you can see here are cross-sectional differences in carotid stiffness. So remember, high stiffness is bad. And what we see is that carotid stiffness is increased across the stages of menopause. But when we randomize women to that intervention and we lower their estradiol levels, we see that carotid stiffness is increased in premenopausal women, perimenopausal women. That's prevented by the administration of that estrogen patch. But what's interesting is when we look at postmenopausal women, we don't see an effect of either the GnRH antagonist or adding estrogen back. And so this suggests that maybe there's a sensitive period for which the large central arteries are acutely modifiable. And this may be important for interventions later on. Of course, my interests are really in the brain. So work that we're currently working on is being conducted through 2 different studies. In the top is work that's continuing in part, it was my F32, and that's going to continue in part through pilot funding through the Ludeman Center as well as the Colorado SCORE. But we're recruiting pre and early perimenopausal women, and it's only one arm. Unfortunately, we are putting everybody into estrogen deficiency by randomizing them to a GnRH antagonist, or not randomizing, but giving them a GnRH antagonist for 12 weeks. We're currently looking at 2 different cerebral vascular beds. We're measuring microvascular cerebral blood flow using MRI through the hospital. I want to highlight Andy Callan, who is an incredible human being, and is analyzing these scans often at 9 o'clock at night to just help me out, as well as measuring transcranial cerebral blood flow using transcranial Doppler ultrasound. But other opportunities that I've had is to work with the Colorado SCORE, of course, led by Wendy Court and Carrie Moreau, in which postmenopausal women are completing baseline testing and then also being enrolled into a similar intervention and randomized to either placebo or estradiol for 12 weeks. In this study, because they are really complex studies, we're only measuring middle cerebral artery blood velocity using transcranial Doppler. Both of these studies are ongoing, but I will just share brief data from the Colorado score led by Wendy Court. So again, these women are randomized to GnRH plus placebo, so they remain estrogen deficient or having estrogen added back. And what we see is, so here on the y-axis, we're measuring cerebral vascular conductance. This is cerebral blood velocity that's adjusted for changes in blood pressure with the intervention. Just know that higher conductance is good. It's indicative of higher blood flow. And what's surprising is that we see when we give estrogen back to postmenopausal women, we don't really see a change in cerebral vascular conductance. But even more so, what's even more surprising is that we see an increase in cerebral blood velocity when they receive that GnRH antagonist plus placebo. What I did not mention, or at least not highlight earlier, is that these GnRH antagonists suppress all hormones, including gonadotropins. And so our intermediate takeaway is that maybe gonadotropins like follicle stimulating hormone might be important for how the brain functions in postmenopausal women. Of course, this work is still ongoing, but I had the opportunity to do some translational work through my F32. And I want to highlight Paul McLean, who is the Colorado SCORE basic project PI, who was really supportive throughout my F32. But this allows us to look a little bit deeper at those mechanisms as the role of what FSH may be playing in the cerebral vasculature. To do this, we took 16-week-old rats. All rats were overectomized, so they had their ovaries removed. And then both groups received a GnRH antagonist to lower all hormones. And one group was randomized to receive a placebo, and the other one was randomized to receive estradiol given through the water. So exact same model as the women, minus we don't overectomize humans, thankfully. The way we look at cerebral vascular function in the brain is using rodents, is that we isolate a very, very small microvessel off of the hippocampus. And I want to highlight Fabrice Dabertran, who was my preclinical mentor, who is also an amazing human being and was very supportive to me, not only with helping me do this work, but also probably emotionally as a clinical scientist trying to dabble in animal work. But what we do is we isolate that vessel and then we cannulate it between two little needles, and that allows us to infuse drugs into that needle and see how the vessel responds when we do that. So I'll present on the left and then go to the right. On the left-hand side, this represents the change in the blood vessel response when we infuse an increasing dose of acetylcholine. Acetylcholine induces nitric oxide mediated vasodilation. So in a healthy vessel, the vessel is going to dilate more. So on this graph on the left-hand side, if the values are going down, that means that's an increasing amount of dilation. If it's up, that means the vessel's actually constricting. So if you're a clinical scientist, you're like, this feels backwards. But what we see is we compared with the estrogen supplemented group, we don't really see any response of the vessel to increasing doses of acetylcholine. But in contrast, when we suppress all hormones and we don't give estrogen back in that placebo group, we actually see an increase in dilation in response to increasing doses of acetylcholine. And you can argue that probably we make the vessel mad at very high doses. The second thing we want to do is infuse a drug called L-name. So if we propose or hypothesize that the response to acetylcholine is nitric oxide mediated, we can give a nitric oxide inhibitor. And what we see when we infuse that inhibitor into the vessel, that both groups actually constrict and that they get smaller. So my takeaway from this is that perhaps both of these vessels are responding to nitric oxide or are being regulated by a nitric oxide process, but how the nitric oxide is being produced is through two different mechanisms. And so the second intermediate conclusion is that perhaps estrogen deficiency contributes to a portion of the accelerated cardiovascular aging in menopausal women. However, there's likely other mechanisms involved. More importantly, in the context of the brain, there's probably redundancies in how our brain regulates itself to maintain blood flow. And that's very important because, of course, all women go through menopause, but not all women develop these disorders. So I want to segue just to talk, I promised sex differences, and while my interests are really in women's health and sex-specific factors in women, I did have the opportunity to work on Carrie's R01 when I first got here, CardioVolt, which looks at the regulatory actions of testosterone in men. And of course, this is studying the loss of testosterone, which is called hypogonadism. Hypogonadism is a sex-specific factor in men for the development of cardiovascular disease. Whereas in women, all women go through menopause, not all men go through have a age-related reduction in testosterone. Testosterone gradually declines with age, beginning around 30 years of age, with an increasing prevalence of low testosterone in later life. The important thing about testosterone, just like estrogen, is that hormones are kind of dirty little factors. They have their little fingers and their influence on everything. And so again, just like with women, where it makes it really hard to understand what are the regulatory of actions of sex hormones, this is also true in men. So men with low testosterone are more likely to have a range of cardiovascular disorders, as well as to have other confounding factors that can also in turn increase their risk for cardiovascular disease. However, if low testosterone contributes to large artery stiffness, independent of these cardiovascular risk factors, is unknown. So again, when I started my postdoc at the very beginning of the pandemic, all work was stopped. And so Carrie was kind enough to let me work on her R01. We're both laughing because it was a story. Her words, not mine. So there's a two-part study for this. So the first part was a cross-sectional study comparing young men, middle-aged and older men with normal testosterone, so values above 400, or low testosterone, values below 300. These are participant characteristics to make a point, in that as we would expect, based on the study design, that these three groups differed by testosterone values. However, in middle-aged and older adults, there was an effect of age on blood pressure, BMI, total body fat. However, these variables did not differ by testosterone status. However, there was both an effect of age and gonadal status on carotid IMT, in that individuals who had low testosterone also had higher carotid IMTs. When we look at cross-sectional differences in carotid stiffness, again, higher stiffness is bad. We see that there's an increase across the groups, and that middle-aged and older men with high testosterone or normal testosterone have higher stiffness, but those who are age, BMI, and blood pressure matched but have low testosterone also have an increase, a significantly greater increase in carotid stiffness. Most notably, the order of magnitude was about 1 unit, which also has been shown to have clinical significance for the risk of stroke and other disorders. So Carrie likes to say she's an equal opportunity scientist. She does ovarian suppression in women, but she also does not limit, or she does not restrict this only to women. She also does it in men. And so we can also apply these GnRH models to isolate the regulatory actions in males. Just like we reviewed before, by administering these drugs, we reduce the production of gonadotropins, which also reduces the production of testosterone. We can also take it a step further by giving an aromatase inhibitor, which will prevent the conversion of testosterone to estradiol. So this allows us to look not only at what is testosterone doing, but what also is testosterone doing independent of estrogen. In this second phase, we took middle-aged and older men with normal testosterone, and we randomized them to this intervention. And the reason for this is that for individuals who have low testosterone, one, they already have low testosterone, but they also, I just showed, already have vascular differences. So if we want to really understand what the regulatory actions of testosterone are, we want to take men that only have an age-related effect, but not necessarily the effects of hypogonadism themselves. So in this phase of the study, all three groups got that GnRH antagonist to lower testosterone. The first group was given a placebo gel and a placebo pill, so they were made to be hypogonadal. The second group got a testosterone gel and a placebo pill, so they had normal testosterone. And the third group got a testosterone gel and aromatase inhibitor, so normal testosterone, low estrogen. Shown here are changes in sex hormones with this intervention. In the blue bar is going to be what are the normal ranges of testosterone, just to make it easy on your eye at this early morning. But what we see, just like I explained in the previous slide, is that by administering that GnRH antagonist plus placebo, we did in fact lower testosterone to very low values. Blame Carrie, not me. In the GnRH antagonist with testosterone group, we saw an increase in testosterone. However, it was within normal ranges, and as well as in the group that got the testosterone gel and the aromatase inhibitor. Next, we're looking at changes in estradiol. Just like before, the blue is going to be the range for normal estradiol values in males. In the group that got the GnRH antagonist, it suppresses all hormones, including estrogen, and we see a reduction in estrogen. Adding testosterone back increases estrogen because more of it's being converted. And then third, in the group that got that aromatase inhibitor, indeed, estrogen was reduced. Shown here are changes in carotid stiffness with that intervention. What we see is that there were no significant changes in carotid stiffness within any of the three groups with the 28-day intervention. And so these really suggest that maybe these changes associated with hypogonadism that we saw in those cross-sectional studies are occurring through more chronic mechanisms that can't be induced in just 28 days alone. We also piloted some work looking at cerebral blood flow in just cross-sectional studies in men with normal testosterone and low testosterone. Again, I want to highlight Andy Callan, who's just a phenomenal human being. Andy, if you're listening, thank you so much for all your work. But what we see, even though these are very limited groups, in part affected by the pandemic, is that despite being age and BMI and blood pressure match, middle-aged and older men with low testosterone have lower cerebral blood flow values compared with middle-aged and older men with normal testosterone. And so these really suggest that men with low testosterone have not only greater large artery stiffness and potentially lower cerebral blood flow compared with age-matched men with normal testosterone, but also that some of these mechanisms are probably occurring through more chronic mechanisms. But most importantly, when we go to cardiovascular conferences, and this is a message I never thought I would ever say publicly, is that we have to consider gonadal status in men and that we have to continue to include men in research. So hopefully, if I've done my job, I've demonstrated that changes in gonadal function across the lifespan are an important contributor to vascular contributions to brain aging. I want to highlight that this is not a one physiology fits all, and that most importantly for individuals who do develop disorders like dementia, that they're probably occurring through complex mechanisms that are also interact with an individual's pre-existing genetic disposition for developing these disorders. The most importantly, when I go and give talks like this, we talk about hormones and all of that, but I think the number one question that I always get, and they're like, yeah, cool, hormones, but like, what can I do to prevent my brain from aging? And so I want to talk just very briefly here towards the end about some other factors that are modifiable that can help to make our brain age less quickly. I think it's probably reassuring to everybody in this audience right now is that education is a protective risk factor for making our brain more resilient as we age. The idea is that with early life education or more education, that it helps to give our brain more skills and more tool sets for maintaining our level of cognition or our ability to carry out tasks as we age and inevitably develop some pathology within our brain. Some work that we and others have previously shown is that having higher levels of education is important for buffering when you do have those cardiovascular risk factors like high blood pressure. And so being more highly educated does help to buffer the negative effects of blood pressure, age-related declines in brain blood flow, and the presence of Alzheimer's disease neuropathology itself. But if you are, importantly, education is generally achieved in the first quarter or if you're like me, the first third of my life. It's important that these factors don't stop with education. There's a number of other factors that you can do throughout your lifespan, and it doesn't really matter when you start them. They're beneficial at any point that can be helped to make our brains more resilient as we age. So in the absence of successful drugs or successful preventive measures, these are things that we can do right now that not only will have benefits for our brain, but also for our daily life. I think everyone in this room, the occupational factors apply to you. I think we all have pretty cognitively stimulating jobs, and assuming that the stress doesn't overstimulate us compared with how cognitively stimulating they are, these having to go about your daily life, to do your research, to be involved with patients, and have interpersonal communication with individuals around you has been shown to be occupationally stimulating and resilient, helping to add to your cognitive resiliency. However, it's not just occupational factors, it's also things that we do in our day-to-day life, even after work. So being involved in our community, being socially engaged with those around us, our friends, our family, strangers out in our community, as well as doing cognitively stimulating leisure activities. So this is where physical activity, of course, is important. Other things like learning to play an instrument, reading books, doing puzzles, all of these things have been shown to make our brain more resilient over time. So I will end just a few minutes early, but I want to acknowledge a lot of people who are shown here who have been really supportive to me throughout my training, including those who are shown in blue here who have contributed directly to work that was presented. This is a shameless free plug for our research. We are recruiting 2 studies right now. Nomen is the estrogen in the brain study, as well as we have a brand new study that's looking at the impacts of shift work on heart health in women that I didn't even talk about. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. DuBose. That was a wonderful presentation. Do we have any questions in the audience? See if we have any chat.
Really good question.
Really quick for the folks online, how do you deal with exercise status, did you say, in the participants?
Great question. We do try to restrict based on activity. It's become more liberal in some of these studies, especially with the estrogen in the brain suppression study. So we do try to control for people who are more recreationally active. It sometimes will extend into people who are just like what is considered normal for Colorado, probably. So just not actively competing in masters events in some of my studies. The additional thing we try to do is we ask individuals about their physical activity, so their self-reported activity, but we also put an objective physical activity monitor on them. It's a thigh-worn monitor that will monitor all of their physical activity worn for 7 days. And we ask them to go about their daily life and just to collect some objective measures of physical activity. We haven't adjusted for that in these studies just yet, but we will look at that. I have a collaborator who's now at the University of Delaware who's analyzing some of these data. Oh no, it's always bad when your mentor asks a question. Carrie Moreau. Yeah. Yes. So for those online, Carrie's asking me to talk a little bit about the new shift work study and what's the physiological impacts of shift work, changes in sleep or circadian misalignment, and how that relates to reproductive health. So the ROSIE study is a study that's funded through my current K-12 Birch. This study is really interested in understanding, we know that shift work itself is a risk factor for the development of heart disease in individuals. What's most important and what's probably been done better in the reproductive literature is that for certain women, they do have reproductive impacts of shift work, and that they're more likely to develop irregular menstrual cycles, perhaps have difficulties getting pregnant, or can have an increase in miscarriage risk. Hopefully the work that I just presented to you shows that sex hormones, which are going to be related to those changes in reproductive health, are an important vascular function in women as well as men. And so we're really wanting to recruit. I should also say that the experimental work that's been done on shift work on cardiovascular function has been 90% done in young college-age males. So there's a pretty significant cardiovascular gap in females for what is happening with shift work. So we are recruiting women who are 18 to 40 who shift work with both regular and irregular cycles and comparing them to women who do day shift work and have regular cycles. It's important women are not the only people who have likely have reproductive or maybe at greater risk for reproductive changes with shift work. There are data that men also have a reduction in testosterone as well. So it's gonadal status is also important for shift workers in both males and females. So excited to get this going. Our first newsletter, Julia Seifert, who is a research assistant who works with me and is incredible. Thank you for being here. The newsletter just went live yesterday. So we are just now rolling this out finally. The question is about, do we study or how does coronary artery calcification scores come into the equation? So the idea is that we're studying even earlier in the pathophysiology. So before coronary plaques really develop. These are predominantly healthy aging studies. So we don't measure coronary artery plaque. We don't measure CAC scores directly, but we do get a surrogate measure of carotid IMT, which starts to increase. But generally, we're studying the earlier pathophysiology prior to that stage. The question was about gender affirming hormone care in both in transgender individuals. So yes, I want to highlight two outstanding clinician scientists that Carrie Moreau is mentoring. Natalie Nokoff, who is doing standard of care research in transgender youth, as well as Sean Iamoto, who is an adult endocrinologist who's also doing standard of care research in transgender adults. So their work is really working on that right now, and they're doing fantastic things.
I was just going to say, I wanted to follow up on that question that Carrie asked just about like coronary artery calcium scores. Can we infer there, is there a correlation between stiffness, large vessel stiffness, and calcium scores or cardiovascular disease measures so that we can, I think as clinicians, think about who is at the highest risk? Mm-hmm. Is that something that is like noted in the literature, the correlation there? Yeah, so the question is, how do CAC scores really relate to aortic stiffness and other large artery stiffening? So yes, so they are related, not work I've ever done, but generally that individuals who have a higher CAC score are also going to have large artery stiffness. It's what I didn't necessarily hint on, but just to kind of explain like how it all relates is that large artery stiffness is not only the elastic properties, but it's also related to chronic changes in the vessel itself. So while they're getting stiffer, they're also having increases in IMT. So having greater plaque burden is also going to increase in that stiffness. Don't worry, I'm not going to call on anybody if I still have time. Yes. The question was, what were my experiences working with animals? It was really fun. I think it was I was doing a lot at the time. And so I think at moments that made it harder to enjoy from day to day, but overall it was a really fun experience to get to do something completely different than what I had done for the past decade. Moving forward, I think I'm going to let the animal people probably do the animal work. I'm not going to tread on their territory, but it's something that I want to continue to use as a model through collaborations. Some of that is probably informed I picked a vessel that you can't see with your human eye. After going from zero clinical experience, not knowing how to pipette, I probably still am not great at pipetting, to getting thrown into the deep end of doing animal work. So that also was part of the equation, but I can't say good enough things about Fabrice and Paul and many other people who helped to make that work possible and keep me upright.
I think the hardest thing is naming a study. Never mind writing it. The hardest part is coming up with a name. So there's algorithm generators, I think, is probably where I came up with it. And I was like, all right, we're running with this. This seems appropriate. At least for the marketing potential, this felt like an obvious opportunity. Wendy Court is asking about emerging evidence that endurance athletes have high CAC scores, evidence of calcified plaque. Can you speculate on the potential impact of cognitive function? Oh, Wendy. I cannot. And the reason being that I think there's probably two different mechanisms at play. I think there's there's a vascular burden itself, but endurance exercise has also been shown to have an independent protective effect on the neurons itself that are needed for carrying out cognition. So it's probably, if I had to speculate, it's going to be great for individuals who are endurance trained or have a long-term history of endurance training, but are starting to show greater age-related declines. I think there's probably other mechanisms involved. It's not necessarily probably the beneficial effects of endurance exercise are being overcome by other factors in the life, but I can't speculate beyond that. Anything else? Otherwise, I'll give everybody 15 minutes back. All right. Well, thank you so much.